There is one complaint I do find commonly among those struggling. Things are not as they ought to be. If I were God, I could do so much better. If I were God, I would never allow for such depravity like poverty, like cancer or world hunger or natural disasters or overpriced resold concert tickets. But why aren't things better? Why aren't things how they should be? What is the world coming to these days? It's all so miserable and the people are apathetic and the houses are so expensive and, you know, but basically, why God, why? Why, God, do bad things happen? Why do bad things happen to me? Well, firstly, are you entirely sure that you want the answer to those questions? Like, are you sure that you want to know why everything happens? Are you sure that you want to understand everything? Because the vivacity and the color of life is that you do not actually know what will happen next. You can volunteer a guess, you can make an educated prediction, but you never really know what will happen next. And you ought to be grateful for that. Because if you really knew it all, were you so burdened by omniscience, the only thing you'd ever wish for would be to be surprised. Seriously, imagine how boring your life would be. It would be a life of no challenge, no conflict, unless, of course, you created conflict for yourself to overcome, which humans are known to do. But then, of course, you'd still know how the story ends. How unfortunate that would be. It's sort of the same as how when you explain a joke, the magic is lost entirely. If someone has to explain the joke to you, it's not funny anymore. You might laugh out of courtesy or obligation, or you may laugh in response to someone else laughing who got the joke, but that's it. You missed the funny, and you can't go back and get it. And of course, asking these questions assumes you're even capable of receiving the answer, as if God would explain to you in plain English the positions of all the particles and exactly how they interacted during the Big Bang and how all this has ultimately resulted in the things that have happened to you. When we think about understanding and explanations, we think about being able to put the workings of things into words. But you can't really explain anything fully that way. The use of words for the description of experience is like an energy transfer chain between organisms that consume each other. You only get about 10% of the energy of what you eat. You know, you've got the lion that eats the gazelle, that eats the plants, that eat the sun. And by the time the lion eats and gets the calories, they've only gotten about 1% of the energy that the plant originally had. Well, when you're experiencing something, you're the plant. You've got 100% of the energy you're taking in the sun. But when you've put that experience into words, you're like the animal eating the plant. You've lost 90% of the energy in the transfer of the experience into language. You could have the highest linguistic talent. You could be the most gifted speaker, the most prolific orator or writer, and still you would be pitifully incapable of fully capturing the richness of life in words simply because of the inherent limitations of the medium. What words do is they delineate. They create arbitrary distinctions for the sake of digestibility. Ironically, of course, the energy transfer chain in ecosystems also exists for the sake of digestibility. But we can't talk about everything all at once, of course. We just don't have the time. But existence is entirely interconnected, and we can't forget that. Everything impacts everything else. There are no separate events. Any separation, any distinction that we see is something that we have created. It is man-made. So we've just got to remember that language is limited as a medium because it is by nature reductive. Now, of course, don't get me wrong, words are still useful. That 10% of the energy that the animal gets is still food. I'm not saying that words are bad. They're even connecting us right now. I would just implore you to remember that words, like any other symbols, are merely tools. Alan Watts would say the menu is not the meal. We must not ascribe the same value to signs and symbols and words that we ascribe to life. But we are in danger of doing that. We've entirely lost ourselves in Excel spreadsheets and accounting books and legal proceedings. But the point is, those great, desperate, metaphysical questions we ask can't be explained in words. God cannot always answer so simply in words. You can't see a four-dimensional object in a three-dimensional space. You can only see its shadow. And that, of course, is the Jungian, the Taoist idea of language. And when you internalize this all completely, then you realize there is no way in which the machinations of life could be explained to you better than by you simply being alive. Your existence is actually both the event and the event's own explanation. And so those questions are sort of ignorant because you actually already do know all of the answers. You are the answer. You just can't put it all into words. And maybe you shouldn't bother trying either. You can put it into music or art instead. And that's it, really. But that's no fun. And rarely do people find that answer satisfying. But it might not be satisfying if you think about it too much. You'll find life makes perfect sense when you're not trying to understand it. But once you've realized this state of affairs, all there's really left to do is just go back to living your life. So let's have some fun. Let's play the game. Why do bad things happen? If God is good, if life is good, then why do bad things happen? Well, simply put, it's because things happen and we call some of them bad. But more than that, I suppose it's because bad and good are actually necessary conditions for the other to exist. Bad has to happen so that good can happen, and vice versa. And they have to happen together in order for you to be alive as you are now. You cannot have one without the other. Ice cream would not be such a treat were every other food comparably sweet. Victory has no meaning without defeat as a dance partner. And it is the trough of the wave that ultimately gives height to the crest. And so good and bad have this sort of harmony. Of course, many of you will know this as yin and yang. But what this means is that any time you feel evil to be winning, or you feel it's all falling apart, you're simply lacking perspective. Say you've got a graph that looks like what they use for the stock market. And of course, the stocks go up and down. But of course, year over year, they generally go up at a decent rate. And that's because as a collective, humans tend to improve their situation and create new things quite often. But if you zoom in real far on one of those graphs at one of the down slopes, and you just look at that, well, then you might think it's all going down and the world is falling apart. And it's natural to think that way when you're living the downslope. But if you zoom out, you'll see this is just one part of a larger picture. You know, this too shall pass and the light will come back round. I find it funny. You can entirely prepare for the future with two very simple statements. Things will get better and things will get worse. But regardless, things will change. This contrast, this sort of dance, is actually necessary for perception because you can only see things through contrast and through change. You cannot see a black square on a black background. And life itself is change. Everything is constantly in motion. And we all intrinsically know this. We just like to pretend otherwise. Even what we call solid is still moving. It's just moving slowly and the energy is packed very densely. But everything is always changing. It's like that old saying that a man never steps into the same river twice, because the man is never the same man, and the river is never the same river. Of course, the river is the same observable pattern, and so we think of it as a constant, but it's really not the same river. It's not even in the same place. In 6 months' time, the river has moved greatly as the Earth has rotated around the sun, and we've moved further out from the center of the universe. And we call that time, which is really just a culturally accepted measurement of collective movement. But all this change, that's life, and that's how we live. Contrast and change are necessary preconditions for existence as we know it because existing is moving, and we've got to have some place to go. That's why negative and bad and evil are necessary, because when you've reached the top of the mountain, and you've still got to keep moving, well, the only way to go is down, which you ultimately ought to be grateful for because being at the top of the mountain doesn't give gratification for too long. It's the climb that we're really drawn to and not the peak. And we see that neurologically. Our dopaminergic circuit, our brain circuits that regulate dopamine, are motivational. We release dopamine when we see ourselves moving towards our goals, when we see ourselves climbing the metaphorical peak. And we see that neurologically. Our dopaminergic circuit, our brain circuits that regulate dopamine, are motivational. We release dopamine when we can see ourselves moving towards our goals, when we see ourselves climbing the metaphorical peak. Contrast is also necessary for you to have any idea of who you are. Say you're a progressivist and you're really fed up with all the social and wealth inequality and the Supreme Court rulings and how all the rich people and the mega corporations don't care about the people and how you think so much change is needed or the world will burn. Well, in a funny way, you are actually reliant on the status quo and on your political opposition for your identity. You could not know yourself as a progressive without people who weren't. Whenever you consider yourself a member of an in-group, just remember that you're actually dependent on the out-group to define you as such. And this is true of anything. Chances are you consider yourself smart. Surely at least as smart or smarter than the average person, right? But you're dependent on the people you think are dumb for that fragment of your identity. You wouldn't be smart without them. Do you consider yourself generous? Do you consider yourself to be helpful? Does thinking yourself to be generous or helpful make you feel good about yourself? If it does, then you are deeply indebted to those who are suffering. Otherwise, you'd have no one to give to. There would be no one to help, and you could no longer be a good person. So the point is, the next time you find yourself facing off with an enemy, smile a little bit. Enjoy the moment. You both give meaning to each other. Contrast enables us to have purpose, and that's why you should love thine enemy. But of course, I didn't need to be the one to tell you any of that. You could have just as easily watched the Christian Bale Batman movies and arrived at the same conclusion if you paid any attention to what Heath Ledger's Joker was saying. But that's why you should be grateful for bad things. You should be grateful for the negative, for challenge, because it's necessary for life and it gives us purpose. It's how we know ourselves. So that's why bad things happen. They happen so that you can be. And that's the statement from Genesis. We are incapable of perfect harmony with God by our own means. We are, by our very constitution, incapable of living in a perfect world. And I think this acknowledgement is extraordinarily useful for building and maintaining a comprehensive and appreciative perspective. I think it's because understanding properly the limits of yourself and your environment are essential for having accurate expectations. Do not honestly expect what you'd imagine to be perfection from imperfect people living in an imperfect world. Don't lose yourself in wishing things were different or how you have thought they could or should be. As if you could even conceive perfection anyway. You are incapable of living in a perfect world. You are incapable of living in a world without problems. And we know this is true because when humans don't have problems, we create problems for ourselves to solve. For as many problems as we solve, we create just as many, if not more. And that's an idea from Genesis 2. We were in the perfect world, but we got all curious and restless, and so here we are now suffering. Dostoevsky does a great job of illustrating this concept in his book, The Possessed. When all of our needs are taken care of, when all of our problems are solved, we will invariably create problems for ourselves to solve, whether that's social drama or politics or business, whatever it is. And you can see it every day now in our vast bureaucracies. All the politicians and the businessmen all say, well, how could we possibly enact these policies? Where's the money going to come from? Well, where did the money come from in the first place? We just made it all up. But our world now is just flooded with symbolic analysis, and that's all we do. Our daily survival is nearly as secure as it can possibly be. So now we've got to go and create issues that... Our daily survival is nearly as secure as it can possibly be. So now we've got to go and create issues so that we've got something to do. We get all caught up about things like the theoretical future value of a business merely for the purpose of giving millions of people something to do. We buy things just so that people can have a reason to make them. It's such a silly little game, but it can be fun to play sometimes, so long as you remember not to take it too seriously. That is fundamentally the human condition, taking too seriously what God has made for fun. But it is a deep human desire to resolve things, and so we have been given things to resolve. We'll solve the Rubik's Cube and then mess it up just so we can do it all again. So be grateful for your problems. We need problems, you know? They give us something to talk about. They've given me something to talk about while I ignore my own problems. And I don't say any of this in a condemnatory nature. It's just an expression of you as you are. You are incapable of living in a perfect world, but so am I. And that's why I pretend all this needs to be said, so that I have something of my own to solve.